Coming up on our newscast tonight, a historic rate cut by Korea's central bank. We turn to an expert for a deeper look into the timing and logic behind that decision. And the Korean won continues to depreciate against the strengthening U.S. dollar, and analysts say it could fall even further. Joint Iraqi forces inch closer to taking back Tikrit from Islamic State militants. If the government forces and Shia militia can continue their advance, they will tip the scale in their favor. For these stories and more, stay with us.
Very good to have you with us. It's Thursday, March 12th here in Seoul. I'm Laah Hyun-kyung.
And I'm Daniel Choy. Thank you for joining us. We'll start with the economic realm. Korea's central bank cut its key interest rate today to an unprecedented low of 1.75% in an attempt to revitalize the economy.
But the move has further prompted concerns about the impact it could have on the country's snowballing household debt. Joining us live at the news center with the details is our Hwang Ji-hye. So Ji-hye, what was the bank's explanation for the cut today?
Well, Hyun-kyung, today's rate cut by 0.25 percentage point to 1.75% leaves the key rate at a historic low, as Daniel just said, and marks the third cut in less than a year. The top central banker said the economy's current recovery momentum is too weak and that it could hurt the country's growth potential. Take a listen.
We drew the conclusion that the pace of recovery in domestic demand is not meeting our forecast for January. And since we agree on the downside risks, we thought it was better to act preemptively.
And Korea's major economic indicators were actually all down this year. Output, consumption, and exports all plunged, while inflation would have dropped last month if it were not for a tobacco price hike. The central bank's move also comes amid a wave of global monetary easing that China and the Eurozone countries are engaged in.
Well, there must be a lot of gloom and concern about the lowered key rate. Now, for example, the household debt issue.
Right, of course. In fact, household debt has been one of the major sticking points among the monetary policymakers, as the total debt already exceeds $950 billion. The government's deregulation drive in the housing sector and the two rate cuts in the second half of last year worked in tandem to boost housing loans. With a historically low key rate, there are also mounting concerns about a massive capital outflow due to a possible rate hike by the U.S. Federal Reserve in the coming months. Whether the rate cut will help boost the economy also remains unclear, while some analysts say the two previous rate cuts did have an impact on propping up home transactions. The record low key rate also raises concerns about the central bank's independence, as recent remarks expressing worries about the sluggish domestic demand by the country's finance minister may have pressured the BOK to cut the key rate.
Shia, so the big question now is how long will this monetary easing policy continue? I mean, did the governor say anything about what action the BOK might take next?
Well, the BOK governor, EGR, said today that the central bank will seek expansionary monetary policies until the economic recovery becomes tangible. But he added that the current 1.75% key rate is sufficient enough to support the country's recovery momentum, signaling that the current key rate will remain intact unless the economy is on track to a solid recovery momentum.
All right, many thanks, Ji-hye, for the updates. And for more on the central bank's rate cut, we are now joined on the line by economics professor Joonsuk from the Catholic University of Korea.
Professor Yang, good to have you with us, although just in voice alone, not in presence.
Yeah. Sorry, I can't be there in person, but I have a day job, so.
Okay, we understand that. Well, let's begin with your thoughts on this issue. Everything important is about timing, of course. In your opinion, was it a reasonable time?
Okay, well, it was surprising. I think most analysts, and myself included, did not expect a rate cut today. Maybe sometime in the near future, but not necessarily today. And I think actually that surprise will actually help the policy because, well, if you expect a rate cut, then people do not really adjust that much of their behavior. But if it's a surprise, then people do change their behavior a bit more. So I think this surprise effect will actually help us.
Professor, for people who don't have an economics background, could you explain how this will help revive the economy?
Okay, well, if you take textbook economics, when you have an interest rate cut, people will either borrow to finance more investment and consumption, or instead of putting their money in a bank, they will put that money in consumption and investment instead. So in some ways, we're counting on more debt. We want people to take more debt so that they will consume and invest more. And this will obviously have some effect on household debt. But Bank of Korea is emphasizing that this rate cut may actually reduce the interest rate payment burdens for people who already have high household debt. I personally have my doubts because a lot of these debts are made in fixed rate interest rates, but it probably will be having a lower interest rate will probably be helpful for those people as well, though not probably as much as Bank of Korea is advertising.
Well, Professor Young, going back a little bit, cutting the rate wasn't as effective the last two times. What makes the central bank so sure that this could work this time around? The third time could be a charm?
Well, I think they are counting on the surprise effect and the fact that this is the first time that the interest rate in Korea is below 2%. So they are counting on some surprise effect. But I think, and I think most analysts will say that given the effect of the last two cuts being at best moderate help, this will also be somewhat of a moderate help. I think the Bank of Korea was interested in two things. One, it's moderate, it's not that strong, but there is a momentum for growth. So they want to keep that hope alive. And second, they want to keep the political problems, political antagonism against Bank of Korea to a minimum. So in that sense, I think the pressure by the politicians and the government worked.
And Professor Yang, you did briefly mention about the potential unwanted side effects, the mounting household debt. Can anything be done to keep the debt in check?
Okay, most measures to keep household debt will work against recovery. So at this point in time, I don't think it's appropriate to worry too much about household debt. However, because we have such a high household debt, that is one of the reasons why rate cuts aren't doing that much for the economy. I think there should be a mixture of short-term and long-term measures, short-term perhaps allowing for more household debt, but have the government issue some long-term plans to reduce household debt once the economy starts to recover. One thing I am a bit sorry about that they announced this measure today is that they did not accompany it with announcements on further fiscal measures, government spending, and perhaps tax measures. I think if it would have been coupled with fiscal measures as well, this announcement would have been much more powerful.
So it may have been a bit rushed. Professor, before we let you go, one quick question. Does the central bank still have room to cut the rate further? What's the outlook in your opinion?
Okay, well, a year ago, a lot of people were worried that if we cut the interest rate below 2%, there would be a lot of capital outflow. But given the last few few interest rate cuts, there doesn't seem to be that much of a problem. So I think there's room for one more, maybe two more rate cuts. But we do need to keep a close eye on capital inflow and outflows. And obviously, we also need to keep an eye out for the U.S. rate rise if it happens. But for now, because China, EU, Japan have all lowered their interest rate, I think it's not as serious a problem, at least for this particular cut.
All right, thank you, Professor, as always, for your valuable analysis. We do appreciate it.
Thank you.
Well, thanks for being with us again. That was Economics Professor Joonsuk from the Catholic University of Korea.
That's right. Now, foreign investment banks have generally lowered their economic growth outlooks for Korea for this year.
The average is in accordance with the Bank of Korea's outlook of 3.4%.
But some have gone down to the 2% range on weaker domestic consumption and falling oil prices. Our Jung reports.
Foreign investment banks were prompt to adjust Korea's growth forecast on mounting downward pressure. According to Bloomberg, the market median for Korea's growth forecast stood at 3.4% on Thursday, in line with the Bank of Korea's forecast. Bloomberg's survey of 27 institutions showed Nomura has slashed its outlook for Korea's growth to 2.5% from its earlier forecast of 3%, becoming the first foreign institution to project an expansion in the 2% range. Analysts cited slumping domestic consumption and slowing exports as factors denting the growth rate, along with the global economy recovering at a slower pace than anticipated. They say external factors such as the prospect of the U.S. raising its interest rate and the weakening of the Japanese yen could also drag Korea's growth down further. But some investment banks have kept their rosy outlooks. Barclays has projected a growth rate of 4%, while Credit Suisse has matched the government's outlook of 3.8%. Inflation projections, however, by foreign investment banks have dropped to 1.3% from an earlier figure of 1.7%, as Seoul is under stronger deflationary pressure this year. Domestic research institutes have also indicated that they could lower the inflation outlook in their quarterly projections next month, with oil prices at a lower level than they projected last year. Son Jung-in, Arirang News.
The Korean won is rapidly depreciating against the U.S. dollar on expectations that the U.S. Federal Reserve will raise its interest rate soon.
But these currency conditions are not expected to have a profound impact on Korean exports. Our Kim Ji-yeon tells us why.
The Korean won has been depreciating against the U.S. dollar this month, mainly due to the strengthening of the U.S. currency. In the month of March, the won weakened about 2.5% against the greenback to close at 1,126 won on Thursday. The Seoul-based Asian Economic Research Institute expects the won-dollar exchange rate to decline even further to 1,150 won within the next 2 months. This on expectations the U.S. Federal Reserve will raise its rate in the coming months and possibly sooner.
The overlying projection is that the Fed will raise its interest rate in April. We even think there is a possibility that it may raise the rate in its upcoming Federal Open Market Committee meeting next week, due to improved unemployment figures in February.
Since the depreciation of the Korean currency stems mainly from the strengthening of the U.S. dollar rather than strong economic fundamentals, local analysts say it won't have a profound impact on boosting the competitiveness of Korean exports. Busan-based BS Financial Group says that's because the currencies of other Asian countries, such as the Japanese yen, are also depreciating against the dollar.
The types of goods exported by Korea and Japan, including steel and automobiles, and their competitiveness comes from the valuation of their local currencies. The already much depreciated yen is gaining the upper hand over the Korean won due to a series of quantitative easing measures from Tokyo since late 2012.
In the month of March alone, the Japanese yen weakened about 2% against the greenback. The BS Financial Group researcher predicts the yen will reach the 130 yen level against the dollar in the coming months, from the current level of 121, which is already a near 8-year low. Kim Ji-yeon, Arirang News.
President Park Geunhye says Koreans have a responsibility and mission to end the 70-year division of the peninsula and to open an era of inter-Korean unification for future generations. Speaking at a commissioning ceremony for new military officers on Thursday, the president said the fundamental foundation of that mission is strong national security. She once again highlighted that the Seoul-Washington alliance remains firm and condemned the recent knife attack on U.S. Ambassador Mark Lippert. Referring to the ever-changing security situation in Northeast Asia, President Park asked the Korean military to innovate and become more creative in leading the country's unification efforts. In his first national address, Prime Minister Lee Wankoo has vowed to eradicate corruption in Korean society. He says the government will get to the bottom of society's chronic ills and irregularities and punish those responsible by utilizing all means, including its administrative authority. He pledged to mobilize the nation's law enforcement agencies and related ministries to ensure there are no failures. The Prime Minister also asked the public to do its part in creating a transparent Korea.
And the word out of Washington is that the recently appointed U.S. Secretary of Defense Ashton Carter will pay a visit to Korea sometime next month. Secretary of State John Kerry may also come to Korea, though on a separate trip. Our Lee Ji-yoon has more.
Two top U.S. officials are likely to fly out to Seoul next month. This is according to Korea-based Yonhap News Agency on Wednesday, citing diplomatic sources in Washington. U.S. Defense Secretary Ashton Carter and Secretary of State John Kerry are reportedly planning separate trips to Northeast Asia in April, including stops in South Korea and Japan. Their visits come ahead of President Park Geunhye and Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe's planned trips to Washington this year. As to what Carter is planning to do while he's here, the report says he's likely to talk about stepping up cooperation between Seoul and Washington to deter North Korean nuclear threats. The focus is also on whether or not he will talk about the issue of deploying an advanced U.S. missile defense system called THAAD to South Korea. Supporters claim deploying the system would better protect the country against North Korea's ballistic missiles, while opponents say it would only worsen relations with China and Russia. U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry is also expected to make a stop in Seoul sometime next month. Yonhap sources say that while he's here, Kerry's likely to address any remaining issues surrounding last week's attack on U.S. Ambassador to South Korea Mark Lippert by an anti-U.S. activist. Kerry may also discuss ways to strengthen ties between Seoul and Washington in the wake of the attack on the U.S. ambassador. Lee Ji-yoon, Arirang News.
Meanwhile, BBC is reportedly reviewing plans to provide a radio news service for people in North Korea. Citing a spokesperson from the British broadcaster, The Telegraph reports that BBC is examining ways to set up a special news channel in Pyongyang. The report added, however, the plan is in its infant stage of development and it could take years before any service is up and running. Plus, if the broadcast is launched, it would probably be aired in Korean rather than in English, relying mostly on shortwave radio.
Iraqi forces are continuing their offensive in the city of Tikrit, making crucial gains as they push through to the city center. If they are successful in taking back the city, it will be a psychologically important victory in the struggle to push back Islamic State militants in Iraq. Arirang's Kim Min-ji reports.
Iraqi security forces and militias pushed toward major landmarks in the city of Tikrit on Wednesday in their biggest offensive so far against the group that calls itself Islamic State. Joint Iraqi forces raised the national flag above a military hospital, one of the latest installations retaken from the militants. Soldiers took out snipers and had to defuse roadside bombs and booby-trap buildings. Citing the head of a key paramilitary force, CNN reports that government troops are now in control of 75% of the city. Tikrit, which is the hometown of former dictator Saddam Hussein, was seized by Islamic State militants last June in a lightning advance. The military offensive that began early this month includes a combined force of up to 30,000 troops. if Iraqi forces regain full control of the city, it will give them the momentum to retake the Islamic State-held city of Mosul, which is 10 times bigger than Tikrit. In an apparent retaliation, Islamic State militants launched a fierce assault in the western Iraqi city of Ramadi. It involved more than a dozen suicide car bomb attacks. Kim Min-ji, Arirang News.
And shifting back to Asia, another major leak at Japan's crippled Fukushima nuclear power plant earlier this week may have raised radiation levels in nearby waters. Plant operator Tokyo Electric Power Company told Seoul-based Yonhap News that the radiation levels in water collected on Wednesday were 30 times higher than the sample collected on Monday. TEPCO said Tuesday that nearly 750 tons of contaminated rainwater had escaped the plant and likely made its way into the ground. Plant officials said, however, that it was unlikely that any of the water had gone out to the sea. The Japanese company has been struggling with decommissioning the plant and pushed its deadline for cleaning up the toxic water to the end of May instead of this month.
Moving over to a different story now. Korea is making moves to expand the nation's food export items to the global halal market following President Park Geunhye's recent visit to the Middle East. To help local food companies understand Muslim dietary laws, Korea has set up a new R&D agency devoted to that task. Our Park Ji-won reports.
The world's Muslim faithfuls follow certain food restrictions. For example, they don't consume pork of any form, alcohol, and animals that are not properly slaughtered under Islamic law. Permissible food is labeled halal, as halal means allowed in Arabic. And in an effort to expand the nation's food export items to the global halal market, a new halal food agency began operations on Thursday under the Korea Food Research Institute. The agency will focus on analyzing halal food standards in diverse Muslim countries like the United Arab Emirates and Indonesia, and provide the nation's food manufacturers with guidelines on how to produce and develop halal-certified foods. The Ministry of Agriculture, Food and Rural Affairs says the establishment of the Halal Food Agency is a follow-up measure of a recent MOU between Korea and the United Arab Emirates to promote cooperation in halal foods. The Agriculture Ministry hopes the MOU and the newly launched Halal Food Agency could help domestic food exporters make easier inroads into the global food market by targeting some 1.8 billion Muslims. The worldwide halal food market is estimated to be around 20% of the global food market. And since the late 2000s, many domestic food manufacturers like Nongshim and Pulmuwon have exported some of its food items, such as instant noodles and snacks that earned halal certifications. Korea aims to double the nation's halal foods exports from some $680 million last year to over $1.2 billion by 2017. Park Ji-won, Arirang News.
Well, the cold spell is lasting a bit longer than expected, but the good news is that iconic flower of spring, the cherry blossom, is set to bloom earlier than usual this year.
Usually they bloom in April or May, but reports say that some regions may get to see them this month.
For details and the forecast, let's turn to our Michelle Bach at the Weather Center. Michelle?
Hi guys, because we had a relatively mild winter this year, plus the unseasonably warm temperatures we are expecting within the next 2 weeks, most flowers are expected to bloom earlier than usual this year. Now, and the cherry blossoms are expected to bloom 1 to 3 days earlier than the normal, depending on the region. Most regions will see them bloom within the first 2 weeks of April, while warmer regions down south may even see them this month. Now, with that in mind, let's have a look at the conditions for the remainder of this week. It's going to stay clear with temperatures getting up into the teens, but rain is also expected to fall tonight through early morning tomorrow. Now, most regions can expect about 5 millimeters of rain, while Gangwon-do is likely to see snow up to 3 centimeters. Now let's have a look at the readings for tomorrow. So we'll start off the Friday morning at 1 and gets up to 9 in the afternoon, while Daegu and Busan will get up both top at 12 degrees. Moving over to other regions, Jeju Island gets up to 16, Dokdo hit to 6 degrees, while Mount Kumgang dips low to -3 degrees. Well, that's all for now. I'm Michelle Park, and I hope you have a wonderful evening.
Thank you for that, Michelle. That brings us to the end of our newscast. Have a great start to your day or a safe drive home. This has been Daniel Choy.
And I'm Laah Hyun-kyung. See you again tomorrow. Goodbye for now.